Hello, and let's talk about Donald Trump's visit to India. The US president, or the leader of the Great Satan as the Iranians refer to him, is visiting India on February 24th and 25th. This is his first visit to the country, and India is going all out to welcome him. We've all heard about the wall that has been built to hide the slums in Ahmedabad, something that would please Trump, who's perhaps the world's leading admirer of walls. Trump has also claimed that 7 million people would greet him in the city, that's 70 lakh people, more than the population of the city itself. Here we clearly have Trump giving our government a run for its money in inflating numbers. And of course we have the irony of perhaps the world's most foul-mouthed leader visiting the cottage where Gandhi stayed. But all these farce aside, what is likely to happen during this visit in terms of Indo-US relations? Before we discuss this further, here are some quick points about Trump's visit. Like we said, this is President Trump's first visit to India. Modi and Trump have met 8 times since Trump came to power in January 2017. 5 of these meetings have taken place in the past 8 months. India and the US have had a bit of a seesaw relationship over the past few years. On the one hand, the US is quoting India as a frontline state in its bid to target China. On the other hand, there are major differences on issues such as Pakistan, trade, intellectual property rights, etc. According to the US Congressional Research Service, in 2018, the United States was India's second largest export market and third largest import goods supplier. On the other hand, US-India trade is only about 3% of the global trade for the United States. India was among the 10 countries placed on a priority watch list by the US Trade Representative's Office for IP violations in April 2019. Some of the areas where discussions and agreements are likely include trade, counterterrorism, H-1B visas, and the Indo-Pacific region. India is likely to buy defense helicopters worth over $3 billion from the US. The two sides have deepened defense cooperation in the recent past, the annual Tiger Triumph drill being a key example. They're also collaborating on the Quad initiative. The nuclear reactor firm Westinghouse and the Nuclear Power Corporation of India, NPCIL, are in discussion to build 6 1,100 megawatt capacity reactors in Andhra Pradesh. There has also been increased cooperation in the area of space, with ISRO launching over 200 US satellites. To discuss more about this, we have with us Benny from Focus on the Global South. Thanks, Benny, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Prashant.
So, Benny, we know that a lot of organizations in India are planning protests ahead of Trump's visit. And one of the other things we also know is that there are many reasons to oppose this visit, of course. Trump's policies in West Asia, he's bringing the world close to war, the kind of coups and coup attempts he's supporting in Latin America. But one of the key aspects is also trade, which you work on. And we've seen the trade war in recent times with China. But specifically with regard to India, what is the kind of US-India trade equation that is going on? And also maybe could you talk a bit about Trump's larger trade strategy itself, if there is one?
Well, there's a widespread perception that Trump is anti-trade. And that's partly true if you look at, one of the first things that he did when he came into power was to pull the US out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
He also pulled the US out of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the EU and the US. But, that's only part of the story, because after doing that, he also pulled the US out of the NAFTA, which was sort of negotiated in 1994.
Right.
And saying that all of these trade deals, including the WTO, were skewed against the US. But he's also got a trade strategy, and it's not so much pro-free trade in terms of the multilateral framework, but it's more transactional.
Okay.
So he renegotiated the NAFTA into what's called the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. He's also signed, after initiating the trade wars with China, Phase 1 agreement. So he has a trade strategy. And part of it is to go the bilateral route.
Right.
And attack countries like India, China, Mexico, Korea that have trade surpluses with the US.
Right.
So one of the first things he did in terms of India was in March 2018, he slapped unilateral tariffs, along with India, many other countries, some of whom I mentioned. Especially in India, it was tariffs on steel and aluminum products. There was an expectation that India would retaliate, but it didn't. But quite soon, within a year, you saw a 40-odd% drop in India's steel and aluminum exports to the US.
Right.
But the Trump strategy is also to protect the US markets in the hope. So the steel and aluminum tariffs are to sort of revive
the industry in the US.
US manufacturing, and it still remains to be seen if that is actually happening.
Right.
But his trade strategy is also to pry open markets. And like you said, there are several areas. So if I can just start off on agriculture.
Right, that's one of the most important issues that Indian farmers right now are raising. In fact, even when Bolsonaro visited, a lot of farmers' organizations had protested, right?
So on agriculture as well, it's a sort of multiple front of attack. One is, of course, he calls India the tariff king, and India has, reasonably, high level of tariffs in certain products, but India has also opened its markets.
Right.
But the Trump agenda in this visit will be to look at, several range of products from, if I can just look at the list from the USTR's page, there's almonds, walnuts, cashews, apples, chickpeas, wheat, soybean, maize, and peanuts. Now, the thing is, India also produces many of these products.
Right.
And like you said, Indian farmers are up in arms because of low prices. One of the big agendas of the farmers' movement is remunerative prices. So, and the reason why India puts these high tariffs is, as many people know, US agriculture is one of the world's most highly subsidized agriculture sectors. You have less than 2% of the US workforce in agriculture. But sort of despite that, the US budgetary support for agriculture is a whopping $867 billion. Okay. In rupees, that is 60,69,000 crores for a percentage of population that is so small. And just in direct handouts to US farmers, this 1.4 to 2%. In 2018, farmers got 22 billion in handouts, which is 1,54,000 crores.
Right.
So what does this mean? I mean, of course, you can subsidize your farmers, you should. But the problem arises when these subsidies get extrapolated into the international market, which allow US farmers from sugar to soybean to cotton. There's a big case against the US in the WTO. So it is a legitimate policy tool for India to stop subsidized products to come into your country and sort of impact the livelihoods.
Especially when it's going to affect your own farmers.
Absolutely.
Whereas what the US would want is that there be a free market in India for all its products to flood it, basically.
Right, a free market for India, but you will still not have a free market and subsidize your agriculture. So I think for good reason, and farmers have written to the Prime Minister to say that India should not. And if you look at India's track record on trade, India just pulled out of the 16-nation mega FTA called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, partly for these reasons. So there is no reason why India should be giving into these US demands on all of these sort of products.
On an aside, what is Trump's fascination with the Harley-Davidson issue? He's been talking about how they're not allowing Harley-Davidson motorcycles into India.
Actually, India does allow Harley-Davidsons, and you'll see quite a few on the road. So initially, the tariffs on Harley-Davidsons were around 75%. There was a sort of push from the US to reduce that, and it's 50%.
Right.
And that's part of and it's one of the few bikes made in the US, so he's got this Make America First strategy, and I think the Harley-Davidson fits into that. So
the other key aspect is the intellectual property rights. Again, something that has often been buried in a lot of it's not a very easy topic for a lot of people to get, because it seems very complicated and there's a lot of legalese around it. So could you just simplify it and explain what the core issue is?
Absolutely. It's a long-standing issue. In fact, for the last 30 years, the US has been attacking India's patent laws. And why is it attacking India's patent laws? Because India's patent laws are progressive and they allow the flexibility for Indian drug manufacturers to produce generic medicines, which are much cheaper. So if you look at products such as HIV drugs, drugs for TB, for cancer, India produces much of these drugs much cheaper than the big pharma sort of companies in the West. And in fact, I think close to 80% of global HIV drugs are sourced from India. So it's important in terms of South-South cooperation and ensuring patients in other countries have these access. It's also important in terms of, access for poor patients within the country. And the US target is basically on two provisions in the Indian patent law. One which allows compulsory licensing, and the other is on Section 3D, which prohibits frivolous patents. So you'll have, if you remember the Novartis case, you had a cancer drug, Glivec, which, the company does some minor innovations, and after the 20-year patent is over, they sort of evergreen. It's called the evergreening, and the Indian patent law doesn't. The patent law is quite strict on these issues, and this, doesn't allow U.S. pharma to sell at the high prices that they want. The other attack is on the prices of medical equipment, especially knee implants and coronary stents, where India has put a price cap again to ensure that poor patients get access. And the US delegation is going to attack India on that issue as well. But this is also an issue which I think, you'll have the health ministry saying that, we need to keep these. It remains to be seen if messages from the health ministry, from patients groups, they've already written letters to the Prime Minister. And there seems to be indications. It remains to be seen what will happen when he's here in Delhi on 25th and signs those agreements. But we are getting indications that there are already meetings happening with the sort of patents office, and there could be some revisions. So that's something we need to look out for.
Right. And finally, there was this larger question of Trump talking about a larger FTA, so to speak, a free trade agreement. So what would that imply?
So the initial idea was an interim trade deal, like I said, on these issues, on the agriculture tariffs, revising India's patent laws, the prices of medical equipment. But, Trump likes to talk big, and he's managed to do a phase one with China. He's done something with Mexico and Canada. So a full-fledged trade agreement would be suicidal for India, and especially because you pulled out of a trade agreement which largely had developing countries because of the fact that your farmers would be impacted. It would compromise your manufacturing policy. And one of Trump's, where he's very pro-trade, is on big tech. And one of Trump's strategies is to get what is called an e-commerce agreement in the WTO. If it's not possible in the WTO, they have something called the Digital 2 rules for e-commerce, which is free data flows, prohibiting data localization. So one of the big ticket items will be on tech, but the trade agreement will go beyond tech. It will look at investment. Another big issue for the US trade delegation is India's FDI limits in media, in banking, in insurance. Multi-brand retail is allowed, but it's only 51%. So the delegation is going to be pushing. So they will do the bilateral route, but I think Trump would like to show that he's managed to sign these trade agreements, which are actually a one-way street. If you look at the China trade agreement also, it's very biased against China, but it remains to be seen if China will actually implement it. And his strategy is to go the bilateral route, sign these big FTAs, which in the expectation that it will bring manufacturing back to the US. But like I said, so far there's no evidence of that.
Thank you so much, Benny.
Thanks.
Before we move on to the next topic, here is some footage from when Trump visited the UK a few months ago. Here is hoping that India responds similarly.
That when future generations come and they ask us, what did you do? as the world slid into authoritarianism and possibly fascism. We don't just say we do what we could, we did what we could, but in the words of Malcolm X, we say we did what was necessary, by any means necessary, to stop the hate and to stop the violence and to stop the bigotry and the racism.
This is a historic protest. And I have to say, I will probably die laughing that we managed to organise a protest bigger than the inauguration of Donald Trump himself.
We now move on to another favorite topic of ours, the Harappans, or the people of the Indus Valley Civilization. A week-long exhibition titled Historical Gastronomica, the Harappan Dining Experience, began at the National Museum on Wednesday. This exhibition is meant to give visitors an idea of the kind of food from those times, but it's missing a few ingredients, or in fact one major section of food, that's non-vegetarian dishes. These non-vegetarian dishes were reportedly removed from the menu at the last minute, owing to some unspecified rules, according to a report in the Indian Express. The museum's additional director reportedly cited sentiments and tradition as the reason for the decision. Some of the dishes that tradition has denied include fish in turmeric stew, quail, fowl, country chicken roasted in sal leaf, bati with dry fish, meat fat soup, lamb liver with chickpea, dried fish and mahua oil chutney. And if you're feeling hungry hearing all this despite having had lunch, I wouldn't blame you. But hunger aside, we'll be discussing the politics around this, and for that we have with us Shabuni. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, first question, did the people in the Indus Valley Civilization not eat meat by any chance?
No, so far what we know about Indus Valley Civilization, the animals that were domesticated, things that they were cultivating,
Right.
but at the same time there is no such evidence to back on the basis of what we can say that exactly this is what they were cooking.
Right.
So definitely cattle was one of the biggest source of meat for them.
Right.
At the same time they were also growing sheep, goat. So certainly meat was part of that, along with other non-vegetarian food like fish.
Right.
Yeah.
So, the National Museum's statement is that theoretically the visitors will be briefed about all these non-vegetarian dishes, but that it's somehow against sentiment and tradition of the museum itself to actually have them served on, at the venue, so to speak. And then there's been some talk about how in the past we have never served this, etc., etc. So how do you parse this kind of statement that is coming out of one of the most leading institutions of history in the country?
No, I find this is very problematic. First of all, when they announce the program, when they have advertised the program, certainly they know that what was being cultivated, what was grown, what were they eating. But at the same time, when we say cuisine, then you also have to have certain definitive understanding regarding recipe, how it was cooked. And we should also keep in mind that Indus Valley Civilization was spread over a large geographic stretch. So there was enormous amount of diversity. Whether there was any form of standardization involved in that recipe formation or not, all these things are very complex issues. We don't know. At the same time, it's also very problematic to say that people of different strata in the Indus Valley Civilization, they all consumed similar kind of food. We know it was a stratified society. So when you say that try to standardize something, I mean cuisine I think perhaps will be a very modern idea. The way we understand today, attribute something, a present day understanding to a remote past, I think first of all that is something very problematic and we should try and avoid not to do that. But also at the same time, when they first decided to have it and then they later scrapped it on the basis of tradition. So certainly I think scientific rational history that we have inculcated, probably they are not upholding that. So they are citing one strand or one brand of ideas as tradition, trying to uphold that, and then they're eliminating what could have exactly happened. Yeah.
And in some senses, this is also reflective of the larger crisis that institutions of history are facing in the country right now. Because, for instance, we have had all that drama in the history congresses about planes being invented, flying 2,000 years ago, and nuclear science. We've had Modi himself say that plastic surgery was in prevalence during the Vedic times. So this seems like yet another instance of a larger atrophy of the institutions of history itself in the country.
Yeah, so a little disagreement that Indian History Congress so far is one institution that has tried upholding certain sense of scientific history writing, secular history writing, and that is something I think government also doesn't like.
Right.
So, I mean, over the past 2-3 years, History Congress is facing major problem in terms of where to hold it and whether they will be having it smoothly or not. But yes, you are absolutely right, Prashant. I mean, we have seen how, and this is not the first time when there was a ultra right-wing government. Before also, they tried tampering with our history, and this is an ongoing process which is happening for a long period of time. It started with the language debate, whether Indo-Aryans, Aryans were a racial community or a linguistic community, and we have also seen how evidences were tampered and a certain brand of thinking was upheld by the right wing as well as certain key institutions of our country as history, and a very important judgment has been passed, and how that has not taken care of evidence, facts, but on the other hand has taken side of faith.
Right.
So at the same time, which is happening, I think in wherever there is a right-wing government, a BJP government, we are seeing how they are trying to tamper with textbook, how certain episodes from our national movement are selectively being eliminated, being scrapped from the syllabus, and they are trying to put somebody as an historic figure, mythical figures are now being portrayed as real, historical, and as you have rightly said that not only in textbook, but people in position of power and in responsible position like chief ministers or members of parliament, they are passing comments which are absolutely unacceptable. So this is happening, and this is a larger part of a larger agenda, larger attack, and which needs to be countered.
And finally, what is the kind of response that the community of historians in India, especially the progressive historians, like you mentioned, historians who are determined to uphold scientific historical methods and rational thinking. So what is the kind of response that is, not on this issue specifically, but on the larger issue you're talking about?
Yeah, on larger issues, definitely historians who believe in certain kinds of practice, upholding on the basis of facts and evidence, you bring out certain arguments, you back with facts, you back your arguments, and on the basis of that you argue. I mean, you may have a position, you may have an ideological leanings, but if your facts are not supporting, just because you believe in something, you cannot say.
Absolutely.
But we have seen that some historians who have stood on the I mean, in terms of the principle of the discipline, who have stood by that and who have also countered certain problematic statements or stupidity that is being propagated, how they have been attacked in recent past, which includes historians like stalwart historians like Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib. But at the same time, when this judgment from High Court came, these were the set of historians who have also put out very strongly their disagreements with the judgment, and also they have cited evidence and tried to tell people that probably this was not history.
Right. Thank you so much, Shravani.
Thanks.
That's all we have in this episode of Let's Talk. We'll be back on Monday at 3 p.m. with the major news developments of the day. Until then, keep watching NewsClick.